They called him the upright man. A soldier who refused luxury, a president who refused a salary, and a revolutionary who refused to bow. But on the very day he stood up to the world's most powerful forces, they made sure he would never stand again. This is the story of the African leader who tried to rewrite destiny itself, and the global machine that moved in the shadows to silence him forever. If you're listening right now, make sure you subscribe and stay till the final second, because this is the part of Sankara's story most documentaries never dare to reveal. Thomas Sankara did not begin life as a symbol. He was born in Yako, a small town in Upper Volta, where dust rose from the earth like smoke and opportunities were few. His parents were modest people. His father a government clerk, his mother a devout Catholic who taught him that dignity was not a privilege, but a responsibility. From childhood, he walked with the quiet certainty of someone who believed he had a purpose, even before he knew what that purpose was. He was brilliant, observant, and strangely disciplined for a boy so young. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors noticed it. Sankara had a way of listening more deeply than others, as though he were storing the world in his mind. He read everything he could find: history, philosophy, military strategy, the liberation speeches of African icons. By adolescence, he was already forming opinions about freedom, justice, and the shape Africa could take if its people rose beyond the limitations imposed on them. But the world around him did not yet match his ideals. Upper Volta was one of the poorest nations on earth, its politics shaped by French influence, its leaders often more loyal to Paris than to their own citizens. Corruption was normal. Dependency was expected. Young men were taught to accept authority, not challenge it. Sankara did not accept that. At 17 he entered a military academy, ironically, the institution that would shape him into the revolutionary the government would eventually fear. Some expected the military to tame him. Instead, it sharpened him. He excelled in tactics, strategy, and leadership, but it was his empathy that set him apart. He didn't bark orders. He inspired. It was here that he met two men who would shape, and eventually end, his story: Blaise Compaoré, who became his closest friend, and the network of French advisors who monitored promising young soldiers quietly, carefully, patiently. They took note of Sankara's intellect. They took note of his charisma. And they worried. Sankara climbed the ranks quickly. Wherever he was posted, whether managing supplies or commanding troops, he became known for integrity that bordered on stubbornness. He refused bribes. He refused privilege. He refused to treat lower-ranking soldiers like servants. In a system built on hierarchy and domination, that made him dangerous. By the early 1980s, Upper Volta was spiraling. The people were starving. The government was deep in debt. Politicians enriched themselves while peasants suffered. International financial institutions demanded structural adjustments, which was a polite way of demanding suffering in exchange for loans. Sankara saw it clearly: the country was independent only in name. His voice grew louder. He criticized the government openly. He spoke about imperialism in front of foreign diplomats. He condemned corruption in front of the politicians committing it. And the people began to whisper his name, not as a soldier but as a leader. In 1983, Sankara was appointed prime minister. It should have been a victory. Instead, it was the moment that put him directly in the crosshairs of France. Sankara met with global leaders who expected him to play by the rules. Instead, he spoke of African self-reliance, economic independence, and the end of neocolonialism. He spoke truth to power with a smile that made his honesty even more threatening. Foreign officials complained. Internal elites panicked. And only weeks later, Sankara was arrested. They locked him away in a dim, hot room. No trial. No explanation. Only silence. But the people did not stay silent. Protests erupted in the streets. Young soldiers defected. Civilians marched on government buildings. And Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's trusted friend, led a military uprising demanding Sankara's release. The government caved. When Sankara walked out of captivity, the air around him felt different. He was no longer merely a soldier or a minister. He was the embodiment of a movement. Weeks later, the revolution took shape. A coup, bloodless, swift, and wildly popular, swept Sankara into power. But this was not like the coups Africa had seen before. The moment he assumed leadership, he did something almost unthinkable. He refused luxury. He refused wealth. He refused the very privileges every leader before him had embraced. And the people felt something they had not felt in decades: hope. He renamed the country. Upper Volta became Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. A new identity, a new direction, a new destiny. But even in these early days of transformation, The enemies of Sankara's vision were already watching. And they were preparing. Because the world had never seen a leader like him. And those who profited from Africa's weakness feared what would happen if he succeeded. More than anything, they feared his ideas. Because Sankara, unlike any leader they had ever faced, spoke as if he truly believed Africa did not need saving. Africa needed awakening. And that belief would cost him everything. When Thomas Sankara assumed power in 1983, the country he inherited was exhausted. The fields were dry, the treasury was empty, and foreign donors treated Burkina Faso like a child incapable of feeding itself. Many leaders would have used this moment to beg for aid, to win favor with foreign capitals, or to enrich themselves before the nation collapsed entirely. Sankara did the opposite. His first directive was simple, almost radical. Burkina Faso must feed itself. He encouraged farmers to grow more, but not through forced labor or punitive measures. Instead, he empowered them. He introduced new agricultural techniques, community granaries, and collective farming initiatives. He lowered the cost of fertilizer and insisted that farmers, not foreign companies, determine how the land should be used. In less than 4 years, food production nearly doubled. Villages that had lived at the mercy of imported grain were suddenly overflowing with harvests of their own. The people felt the change. For the first time, they saw a president kneeling beside them in the soil, working with his hands, speaking not as a ruler but as a fellow Burkinabe. When he traveled through the countryside, he refused parades and refused government banquets. Instead, he ate what the villagers ate. He slept where the soldiers slept. He insisted that a leader could not demand sacrifice unless he lived it. He practiced what he preached. Sankara sold the government's fleet of Mercedes sedans and replaced them with modest Renaults. He cut ministerial salaries, including his own. He prohibited officials from flying first class, banned luxury allowances, and erased the line between leaders and citizens. His humility was disarming. His discipline was magnetic. And it terrified those who benefited from the old system. Corrupt politicians lost their special privileges. Middlemen who made fortunes smuggling resources found their networks collapsing. Foreign companies accustomed to sweetheart deals suddenly found new regulations and an unyielding leader who refused to be bought. But Sankara wasn't finished. He launched a nationwide vaccination campaign, one of the most ambitious the continent had ever seen. In a matter of weeks, over 2 million children were vaccinated against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever. The results shocked global health organizations who praised Burkina Faso as an example to the world. He built railways, schools, and hospitals, not with foreign contractors but with Burkinabe workers themselves. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was a declaration: we are capable. We do not need to be rescued. Sankara also championed women's rights with a boldness the region had never witnessed. He outlawed forced marriages, condemned polygamy, criminalized female genital mutilation, and encouraged women to serve in the military. He appointed women to positions of power and spoke openly about the structural oppression they faced. He insisted that a country could not rise when half its population was held down. Many applauded him. Many quietly despised him. Foreign powers watched carefully. Their influence in West Africa had always depended on compliant leaders, and Sankara was anything but compliant. He criticized the World Bank. He rejected IMF loans. He accused former colonial powers of maintaining invisible chains through debt, trade, and political pressure. During a landmark speech in Addis Ababa, Sankara addressed African heads of state with a bluntness that left the room in stunned silence. He warned that Africa's debt had become a new form of slavery. He urged leaders to stand together and refuse to pay unless the countries that had exploited Africa repaid what they had stolen. His voice was firm, fearless, and uncomfortably honest. But when he finished, the applause was hesitant. The silence was louder. And Sankara realized he was standing alone. By openly challenging the global economic order, he had crossed an invisible line. And those who controlled that order took note. Intelligence agencies began monitoring him more closely. Envoys traveled to Ouagadougou with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Influential businessmen complained that Sankara's policies threatened stability, a word often used when profits were in danger. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, a different storm was forming. The very people who stood beside him at the beginning, the soldiers, the ministers, the revolutionaries, were beginning to feel overshadowed. Sankara's integrity made them uneasy. His refusal to indulge in corruption made their old habits impossible. His popularity grew so rapidly that some feared he was becoming larger than the revolution itself. No one felt this tension more deeply than Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré and Sankara had once been inseparable, bound not just by friendship but by ideology. They dreamed of a new Africa, a liberated Africa. But as the years passed, their paths began to diverge. Sankara embraced radical self-reliance, rejecting all foreign influence. Compare believed alliances were necessary, even with countries Sankara criticized. Sankara demanded discipline from the military. Compare sought loyalty within it. Whispers began to circulate in the barracks. Foreign diplomats visited Compare more often. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Something was shifting. Sankara sensed it. He felt the unease growing around him, the distance forming where closeness had once existed. But he refused to compromise his principles. He refused to slow his reforms. He refused to dilute his message for the sake of political survival. He believed that truth was worth more than power. He believed that Burkina Faso, once awakened, could never be conquered again. He believed that the revolution would outlive him. What he could not know, was that the people he trusted most were already choosing sides. And some had decided that Sankara, with all his brilliance and integrity, had become too dangerous to keep alive. The countdown to his betrayal had already begun. And every step forward only brought him closer to the moment history would turn against him. He had changed a country. He had given a nation a new name, Burkina Faso. He had planted forests where there was desert, built schools where there was ignorance, and ignited hope where despair had rotted for generations. But every revolution has its enemies. And every dream carries the seeds of its own destruction. In the years after the name changed, the world began to watch him carefully, not with admiration but with concern. Those who profited from Africa's dependence, those who thrived on the silence of its poor, those who saw distant capitals as open treasure chests, they began to whisper behind closed doors. Their wealth, their power, their leverage threatened by a man who refused their money, their deals, their control. At home, the effects of his policies rippled outward like a rising tide. Food scarcity decreased as farmers gained land and dignity. Public health initiatives vaccinated millions of children. Education surged. Women, previously silenced and sidelined, rose into positions of responsibility and influence. The old elite, the landlords, the bureaucrats, the profiteers, felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Many saw in him a savior. Others saw a threat. Abroad, foreign powers, embassies, multinational corporations, they saw danger. Not to themselves but to the system. When one country dared to resist dependency, others could follow. When one leader refused to bow, others could learn. Inside the government, cracks began to form. Some generals who once stood behind him began to question. Some ministers, once loyal, started to distance themselves. The markets he tried to liberate, agriculture, local industry, natural resources, they were now controlled by men who had tasted power too long to surrender it quietly. And at the center of this gathering storm stood his closest friend, his brother in arms, Blaise Compaoré. They had shared rifles, ideals, and dreams. Together they had brought the old regime down. Together they had taken power. Together they were supposed to build a new nation. But Compaoré began to hesitate. In private corridors, foreign envoys offered him alliances many times more lucrative than the meager salary of revolution. They promised influence, protection, wealth. They offered him a return to the comfort Sankara rejected. Clothes, cars, luxuries, status. Sankara sensed it. On cold nights, he would sit alone on the porch of the presidential residence, listening to distant drums, distant laughter, distant deals. He heard whispers of dissent. He felt the tension in the eyes of men who once looked at him with trust, now looking with caution. He tried to reach out, to offer dialogue, to remind his comrades of the oath they took. But every conversation ended with silence, eyes turned away, hands clenched. Loyalty was becoming a commodity, and he was no longer the only one bidding for it. By mid-1987, the pressure reached a boiling point. Burkina Faso's economic independence, once a shining beacon, was now a burden. Trade partners pulled back. Foreign aid dried up. International lenders applied pressure. Internally, food shortages began to resurface. Opposition media, where they existed, began to whisper. Traditional chiefs subtly undermined land reforms. Every reform, every policy, every ideal had become both weapon and target. Sankara knew it. More importantly, so did his enemies. On a humid night in July, he convened a private meeting. Only a few trusted ministers. He laid bare the threats, foreign interference, internal betrayal, corruption rising even within the army ranks. He warned that the revolution was no longer just under attack from outside, it was bleeding from within. He looked around the dimly lit room, eyes tired but burning. He said, "If the ideals of the revolution are corrupted, we will have betrayed the people." Hands met hands. Promises whispered. Loyalty pledged under lantern light. They shook hands. But in that handshake, between hope and fear, betrayal had already begun. Shortly after that night, Sankara's visits to embassies increased. Conversations in foreign languages replaced old camaraderies. Documents were signed, alliances made. The old elite found safe haven in the shadows. Sankara sensed time slipping. Not for him, for the dream. He accelerated reforms. He redistributed more land. He announced more tree plantings. He closed deals with peasants, unions, youth organizations. He spoke on radio stations across Africa, warning that Africa's independence would never be handed, it must be taken. Each broadcast echoed across borders. Each speech raised hope. Each decree unsettled power. And in that tension the final trap was set. They believed they could break him quietly, slowly, without blood. They believed they could wait for public support to fade, for hunger to return, for people to despair, and then step in as saviors. They were wrong. Because Sankara did not wait. He refused to bargain. He refused to compromise. Silence no longer served him. The revolution demanded a voice. And his voice, unyielding and loud, would carry across the land, even if it was speaking from beyond the grave. Burkina Faso woke each morning to the sound of change. New roads were being built, new schools rising from dry earth, and communities once forgotten were finally being seen. But beneath the rhythm of progress, beneath the pulse of hope, the ground had begun to tremble with a silent danger. Thomas Sankara had enemies, but what he didn't realize was how close they had gotten, and how far they were willing to go. Inside the army barracks, conversations had shifted from loyalty to survival. Officers who once praised his discipline now whispered that he was pushing the country too fast. They spoke of shortages, of sanctions, of the tensions building with neighboring governments who felt threatened by Burkina Faso's example. And at the center of these whispers stood the man who once called him brother, Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré had become the bridge between foreign powers and internal dissenters. Diplomats who once struggled to influence Sankara found a more willing ear in Blaise. The meetings grew frequent. Dim rooms, hushed tones, coded messages. Deals were drafted that promised stability, but at a cost. A cost Sankara would never accept. Foreign governments had grown impatient. They needed someone they could work with. Sankara was not that man. He refused their loans, challenged their influence, and rejected the idea that Africa must remain dependent. And so, pressure mounted. Allies withdrew support. Trade lines tightened. Burkina Faso's internal elite, chiefs, landowners, businessmen, seized the moment to blame Sankara for their discomfort. Meanwhile, Sankara pushed harder. His speeches sharpened. His reforms deepened. His stance against corruption hardened. He blocked privileges, cut salaries, and dismantled systems that benefited a few at the expense of millions. He believed the revolution was still young, fragile but growing. He refused to slow down. And that refusal became the fuel for betrayal. One evening, Sankara received intelligence reports hinting at a coup being discussed in military circles. He read the documents quietly, face unreadable. When he looked up, the room was still. His officers waited for his reaction. Anger, fear, alarm. But Sankara simply folded the papers and whispered, "The revolution owes us nothing. We owe everything to it." He refused extra protection. He refused to treat his comrades as threats. He refused to fear death. And that was the moment the conspirators realized something crucial. Thomas Sankara would not defend himself against them. Not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Weeks before the assassination, Sankara gave a speech to a group of youth volunteers. His voice was steady, though shadows had begun to settle behind his eyes. He told them, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." Some in the crowd cheered. Others cried. And among the listeners, hidden deep in the audience, were men paid to watch him, to report his movements, his tone, his strength, his weaknesses. The plot tightened. Compaoré began withdrawing from public events. He excused himself from joint speeches. He skipped council meetings. And when he did attend, he arrived late, left early, and avoided Sankara's gaze. Sankara noticed. One night, he attempted to speak to Blaise privately. He visited his home without his usual escort, walking through the quiet streets with only the dim lanterns lighting the path. A maid answered the door, nervous, stalling, explaining that Compaoré was not available tonight. Sankara nodded. He did not insist. He walked back into the night, alone. The distance between them was no longer a rumor, it was a wound, open and bleeding. Inside Sankara's circle, generals debated the timing. Foreign agents coordinated the logistics. Funding, arms, communication, everything was falling into place. What they needed now was the perfect moment. A moment when Sankara would be vulnerable, predictable, exposed. They chose the National Council meeting, a weekly gathering where Sankara met unarmed with his closest ministers. No guards inside. No weapons. Only trust. The conspirators wanted a clean strike. Swift. Irreversible. A coup wrapped in the illusion of inevitability. Days before the meeting, Sankara confided in a friend that he felt something changing in the air. Something heavy, something cold. He said, "If death comes, it will not surprise me. But I will not run from it." Those words were not dramatic. They were not poetic. They were simply true. As the final hours approached, the city moved with an uneasy quiet. Soldiers loyal to compare shifted positions across the capital, pretending to prepare for routine exercises. Trucks were strategically placed. Radios tuned to coded frequencies. New orders circulated under the cover of night. And then, just before the sun rose on that Thursday morning, the final command was given. The men who once saluted Sankara tightened their rifles and prepared to kill him. The brothers who once marched by his side readied themselves to erase him. The nation he had lifted was about to be plunged into its darkest hour. But Sankara did not hide. He did not flee. He did not resist the meeting. Because he believed something the conspirators could never understand. A life can be taken. But a legacy can rise from the grave. On the morning of October 15, 1987, the sun rose quietly over Ouagadougou, casting a pale glow across the capital. The city looked peaceful, unaware that history was about to be shattered. Thomas Sankara woke early as he always did. He dressed simply in his fatigues, tied his boots, and stepped outside to breathe in the morning air. The world felt strangely still. Even the birds seemed hesitant, as if nature itself understood the weight of this day. He rode to the National Council meeting on his motorbike. He did not take the official car. He did not bring armed guards. For him, leadership was not a throne to secure but a responsibility to live honestly. That was the essence of Sankara, a man who walked like the people he served. As he approached the council building, a group of soldiers stood nearby, pretending to guard the perimeter. These were not his loyalists. These were the men sent to end him. But Sankara nodded politely as he passed them, unaware that in just a short while, their rifles would be aimed directly at his heart. Inside, the ministers gathered around a simple wooden table. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, men whispered quietly. Sankara walked in smiling, greeting each of them with warmth. If he was afraid, he did not show it. He sat down and prepared to begin the meeting. Outside, however, engines roared to life. A convoy of armored vehicles rolled toward the building. Soldiers jumped out, surrounding the perimeter like hunters circling prey. The ministers heard the commotion. Boots stomping, metal clanging, radios crackling. The room fell silent. Sankara stood up instinctively. His face did not harden. It did not panic. He simply breathed out, long and slow, as if accepting something he had already made peace with. Gunfire erupted. The windows shattered as soldiers stormed the building, rifles raised, eyes cold. Sankara raised both hands slowly and said in a calm voice, "If it is me you want, here I am." He stepped forward, shielding the others behind him. He did not beg. He did not plead. He did not run. He simply stood the way he had lived, unbroken. The first shot struck him in the chest. Then another. And another. The bullets tore through him, but he did not fall immediately. Witnesses later said he seemed almost suspended in that moment, as if the force of what he represented refused to collapse so easily. When he finally hit the ground, the room exploded into screams. Ministers dove for cover. Soldiers fired wildly, murdering 12 of Sankara's closest companions. The assassins dragged Sankara's body outside and tossed it into the back of a truck like contraband. They drove it to a secret location, buried him unceremoniously, and tried to erase every trace of him. His guitars, his diaries, his photographs, all confiscated. His name was banned from newspapers. His speeches forbidden from broadcast. His vision labeled extremist. Blaise Compaoré announced that a tragic accident had taken the president's life. He promised order, stability, and cooperation with international partners. But no matter how deeply they buried Sankara's body, they could not bury the man. Whispers spread across Burkina Faso. Men cried inside their homes. Women lit candles. Children drew his name in the dirt. Elders said, "A spirit like that does not die." Markets stopped. Work ceased. Soldiers loyal to Sankara wept openly. The nation moved like a wounded animal, stunned and grieving. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of fading, Sankara's legacy began to grow. His speeches, once censored, were secretly copied and passed hand to hand. His ideas spread to universities, to labor unions, to artists and musicians. Across Africa, leaders who once dismissed him now quoted him. Youth movements chanted his name. He became a symbol, a reference point, a fire that refused to dim. International journalists started investigating the assassination. Evidence pointed clearly to Compare and his foreign allies. Documents leaked. Testimonies surfaced. Even the conspirators who once stood proudly beside Blaise began to waver. Years later, when the people finally rose against Compare's dictatorship, they marched with Sankara's portrait held high. They called him their true president, their real hero, their eternal guide. And when Compare fled the country in 2014, it was Sankara's spirit that led the uprising. In the years that followed, Burkina Faso began officially investigating his assassination. His body was exhumed. His killers were named. Justice, though delayed, finally spread its wings. Today, Thomas Sankara stands not as a fallen leader, but as a continent's moral compass. He is the reminder that integrity is possible. That power does not have to corrupt. That leadership can be humble, disciplined, and compassionate. That a man with no wealth, no mansion, no luxury, only vision, can change the destiny of millions. His life was short. His presidency even shorter. But his legacy is endless. He once said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. It comes from nonconformity, from the courage to turn your back on the old formulas." He lived those words. He died for those words. And today they remain the core of the revolution he began, a revolution that did not die with him. So as we close this chapter, remember this truth. Thomas Sankara did not simply lead a country. He awakened a continent. He challenged the world. And even in death, he won. Thank you for listening to this story. If you want more fearless history, more hidden truths, and more voices that were never meant to be silenced, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who deserves to know the truth. The story of Thomas Sankara lives on, as long as we keep telling it.